There are men who leave behind money when they die. And then there are men who leave behind a world. Phil Robertson, the bearded patriarch of Duck Dynasty, founder of Duck Commander, and one of the most unapologetically outspoken voices in American popular culture, was the second kind of man. When he passed away on the morning of May 25, 2025, at the age of 79, surrounded by the family he had loved, fought for, hurt, rebuilt, and ultimately defined himself by, the grief that swept through the Robertson household was not simply the grief of losing a father. It was the grief of losing the gravitational center of an entire universe. And what he left behind, not just in money, but in letters, in land, in legacy, and in the impossible weight of expectation, made every single person in that family cry in ways they had not anticipated and could not explain. Phil Robertson had told them not to cry. He had said it for years, with the kind of certainty only a man who has stared down his own death and made genuine peace with it can manage. He told his family directly, in his final days, that he was happy about where he was going, that the destination was not something to grieve but something to celebrate. He told them that mourning him would mean misunderstanding everything he had ever tried to teach them. Death, in Phil's theology, was not an ending. It was a homecoming. But when the moment came, when the room fell quiet and the man who had seemed as permanent and immovable as the Louisiana bayou itself was simply gone, none of them could hold to his instruction. The love was too large. The absence was too complete. The Robertson family had shared the news publicly in December 2024 that Phil had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, revealing it during an episode of the family's podcast. For the millions of fans who had watched him preach, hunt, argue, and laugh across 11 seasons of television, the announcement landed like a blow. But for the family, it was the confirmation of something they had already been quietly enduring for months: the slow, merciless erosion of the man they knew. Alongside Alzheimer's, Phil had also been battling a serious blood disorder that was attacking his body from a different direction, causing him escalating pain and robbing him of the physical mobility that had always been central to his identity. The man who had once moved through swamps and forests with the ease of someone born to that wilderness was struggling to walk without crying out. It was a cruelty that felt almost biblical, a giant being brought low not by an enemy, not by failure, but by the slow betrayal of his own body and mind working together against him. By the spring of 2025, updates from the family had grown heavier in tone. Professional care had begun. The spaces between public appearances had grown longer. Jace Robertson, Phil's son, was honest with the world about what was happening, as he had always been, because honesty was something the Robertson family understood as a form of respect. Phil was not good. They were making him comfortable. Those few words told the world what the family was quietly enduring every single day inside that home in West Monroe. In the final weeks, Phil still managed to record a few last episodes of the podcast he had hosted for years. His voice on those recordings carried something of its old conviction, that unmistakable rumble of a man who had long since stopped worrying about whether people approved of what he was saying. Those recordings would later feel to his family like a parting gift, a final transmission from a man who believed his voice was meant to carry truth into the world for as long as breath permitted. And then, on May 25, 2025, the breath stopped. He was 79 years old. He was at home. He was at peace. The family announced a private funeral service and said a public celebration of his life would follow at a later date. That decision, to grieve privately before celebrating publicly, was itself an entirely Phil Robertson kind of choice. He had never performed his faith for a camera or staged his family life for an audience. What mattered to him happened behind closed doors, at tables where scripture was read before meals, in the quiet of early mornings before the rest of the world woke up. To understand why Phil Robertson's passing carried the weight that it did, why the fortune he left behind made his family weep not from gratitude but from the sheer enormity of what it represented, you have to understand where it all began. Not on television. Not in a boardroom. But in the kind of poverty that shapes a person at the molecular level and never fully lets go. Phil Robertson was born in 1946 in Vivian, Louisiana, the fifth of 7 children. He grew up in a home without electricity, without indoor plumbing, without any of the comforts that most Americans of his generation took for granted. His family did not hunt for sport. They hunted because the alternative was hunger. Fishing was not recreation. It was provision. The land was not scenery. It was the thing standing between the family and a hard season. That early relationship with the natural world, the bone-deep understanding that a man who knows how to work with his hands will never truly starve, never left Phil Robertson. It became the philosophical bedrock for everything he would later build. His natural athletic ability was considerable enough to earn him a football scholarship to Louisiana Tech University, where he became the starting quarterback in 1966 and 1967. His backup during those years was a young man named Terry Bradshaw, who would go on to become one of the most celebrated quarterbacks in the history of professional football. Most young men who found themselves ahead of a future Hall of Famer on the depth chart would have recognized what that meant and pursued it accordingly. Phil Robertson walked away from the sport entirely when it began interfering with duck season. He was not being reckless or foolish. He was being, with absolute clarity, himself. He valued freedom over fame. He valued the swamp over the stadium. That choice, made at a young age, was the first statement of an identity that he would spend the rest of his life reinforcing. After college, Phil worked as a teacher. He worked as a commercial fisherman. He ran a bar for a period. And then, in 1972, he turned a lifelong obsession into a business. He had always been dissatisfied with the duck calls available on the market. They did not sound right to him, did not mimic the real thing closely enough to fool a bird that had heard everything. So he began making his own. He invented the Duck Commander call in 1972, obtained a patent, and incorporated the Duck Commander Company the following year. The business began, as all great American businesses begin, out of a personal frustration and a stubborn belief that he could do better. But before Duck Commander became a business worth celebrating, and long before Duck Dynasty made the Robertson name familiar to tens of millions of Americans, Phil Robertson was a man in serious trouble. He has spoken about this period of his life with a candor that bordered on ruthlessness, because Phil Robertson believed that softening the truth was a form of dishonesty, and dishonesty was something he had no patience for, especially about himself. In his 20s and early 30s, alcohol dominated his life and nearly destroyed everything in it. He was absent. He was volatile. He made choices that left deep wounds in his marriage and in his children's earliest memories. Kay Robertson, who had married him young and had given everything to holding their family together through circumstances that would have broken most people, prayed constantly and refused to abandon him when most women would have had every reasonable justification to do exactly that. Her faith and her stubbornness were, in the truest sense, what saved him. The turning point came in a small church in West Monroe, where a preacher had been deliberately sent to reach Phil after a family member made the calculation that if Phil Robertson ever converted, the depth of his conviction would make him someone worth converting. The story has been told many times, but it never loses its power. Phil walked into that encounter defiant and walked out transformed. He gave his life to Jesus at the age of 28, and from that moment forward, every decision he made flowed from that commitment. He rebuilt his marriage to Kay. He apologized to his children. He poured the same fierce energy he had once directed towards self-destruction into work, faith, family, and the slow construction of a life worth handing down. His Christian conversion did not make him softer or more accommodating. If anything, it made him more intense, more direct, more willing to say exactly what he believed without cushioning it for the comfort of his audience. The difference was that now that intensity was pointed towards something real, something that had cost him everything and given back more than he deserved. He baptized people in the river. First dozens, then hundreds, then thousands over the decades that followed. His sister had told the preacher that converting Phil Robertson would mean converting thousands through him, and she was proven right by an extraordinary margin. His testimony, the story of a man who had hit the bottom and been pulled up by grace, resonated with people in ways that no polished sermon ever could, because it was not polished. It was just true. Duck Dynasty premiered on A&E in 2012 and quickly became something that no one at the network had fully anticipated, a genuine cultural phenomenon. At its peak, the show drew nearly 12 million viewers per episode, making it one of the most watched programs in the history of cable television. That number represented not just curiosity but loyalty, the kind of audience that felt personally connected to what they were watching because what they were watching felt real. And it was real. Phil Robertson was not playing a character. He was not moderating his language or adjusting his opinions for the camera. He talked about faith the way he talked about everything, directly, without apology, and with the underlying assumption that if you disagreed, the problem was probably yours to sort out rather than his. Every episode ended with the family at a dinner table, heads bowed in prayer. In a television landscape that had learned to avoid religion as a subject too combustible to handle, that image was quietly revolutionary. The fame, however, brought the kind of exposure that eventually forces a man to choose between his beliefs and his comfort. In 2013, a magazine interview ignited one of the largest media controversies of that era when Phil spoke bluntly and unapologetically about his views on homosexuality, framing his positions entirely in biblical terms. The reaction was swift and severe. The network suspended him. Advertisers began distancing themselves. Civil rights organizations called for apologies. And Phil Robertson, as predictably as the sun rising over the Louisiana bayou, refused to give them. He stated that his beliefs came directly from Scripture, that he had said what he believed, and that he saw no reason to unsay it. What followed was something the network had not calculated. Conservatives across the country rallied around him with a ferocity that surprised everyone. Duck Commander merchandise sold out completely. Petitions circulated. The public pressure on A&E became overwhelming, and within weeks, Phil Robertson was reinstated without having retracted a single word. It was, in its own strange way, one of the clearest demonstrations of the cultural divide running through American life at that moment, and Phil Robertson had not created that divide. He had simply stepped into the middle of it without flinching. Over the years that followed, he remained a fixture in conservative American politics and media, endorsing candidates, speaking at events, and hosting the Unashamed podcast with his son Jace, where he continued to deliver the same message he had always delivered, that faith in God was the only foundation worth building on, and that the rest of it, the money and the fame and the controversy, was secondary at best.